Good day, and welcome to another edition of Agent X11, Hollywood Dark Journalist. Another light in this darkened world. I'm your host, Penny Shepherd, and I am Agent X11. My co-hosts are David Zublick, Heather Day, Joan Renee, Brad Connolly, Chris Montgomery, Skip Press, Tom Althouse, Jessica Garza, Edward Medallion, and Savage 17.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are tonight's entertainment.
Hollywood Dark Journalist begins now. And welcome to another episode of Agent X11, Hollywood Dark Journalist. I'm your host, Penny L.A. Shepherd. Look at that. I got us all in. And
Yay.
I am Agent X11. Normally, I'm like not even on the board and I'm talking and no one can hear me. So it's a lovely Friday in my remote location. Friday, April 4. Joan Renee is my co-host. She's now been elevated to associate producer for the Awake Nation. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes, and she is on the board and ready to go. And she's like, "What's that button? Don't push it. Don't." It's like David with the neuralizer, he's got one of those. He does. And the last time he used it, literally, it erased the entire show. I told him, don't do that, all right? Just don't do it. And our guest today is Skip Press, and this episode is a fabulous, fabulous episode, which, when you came up with this idea, I thought, I guess it is time for this, because we have entered into a new epoch in our history, and it's time for a happier day, but we need to revisit our past in order to understand. So hopefully I get this right. You leave me on my own. Mostly I got all the atoms wrong.
No, it's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So America is a golden eon for a smart person. Sometimes I'm not so smart. Skip Press.
Even the heights of the presidents right there are appropriate.
Right. Okay. Then. It looks like a lot of them. Only it's the same one, just different stages in their history. James Madison, we're going to be talking about, the 4th U.S. president, and James Monroe, the 5th U.S. president of the United States. And shall we play your intro? Because I talked all over everything.
Sure.
Okay. Let me find it. How are you, Skip?
I'm good. I'm really good. It's warming up in my snowy mountain town. So
nice. Okay. Well, it's flooding biblical floods all over everywhere else. Are saying that it's going to be like what, 15 inches in some places.
Tornadoes. I know. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
it's insane.
Yeah.
So here we go with Skip Press, America's Golden Eon, A.G.E.
Agent X11 is proud to present America's Golden Eon, A.G.E, with Skip Press.
American, I am an American. From sea to shining sea, America is the land of the free. From our early history, American Golden Eon, A.G.E. If we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, we will cause him to withdraw, and our nation will be forsaken. Love that neighbor as thyself, for justice be ever thirsty. Walk in ever-present love, and always showing mercy. From sea to shining sea, America is the land of the free. From our early history, American Golden Eon, A.G.E. America, American, I am an American. America, American, I am an American. American. America, American, I am an American. America, American, I am an American. America is the land of the free. From our early history, American Golden Eon, A.G.E. America, American, I am an American. America, American, I am an American.
Agent X11's America's Golden Eon, A.G.E, with Skip Press begins now.
And Skip.
What's that?
She stopped talking.
Skip.
Good morning, Skip.
Good morning. Good morning. So here we are with two presidents at a time today.
Two presidents in one.
Yeah. There they are. Yeah. So on the right there, down in the lower left, you see that's Madison, and he was only 5'4".
Really?
And, yeah, and which we'll see in the little video you're going to play in a second. And Monroe was 6 feet. And
wow.
Yeah, and I learned something today about this. Thomas Jefferson was half an inch taller than George Washington.
How tall was George Washington?
George Washington was 6'2". You know, you think of George Washington as being huge. A lot of people were short in those days, and so I guess 6'2" was huge. But Thomas Jefferson was 6'2.5".
Okay.
You know, so
well, I mean, average height for the men in my family is 6'3".
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well,
I'm short. I'm only 5'6".
Oh, well, they could be president then, I guess.
Right. Well, how tall is Trump? Is he 6'3"?
Yeah, he's 6'3". Yeah.
And how tall is Barron?
Who?
Barron, his son, is he 6'8"?
Oh, Barron is 6'9".
Oh my God!
He's a massive
Lincoln's disease.
Oh, he's huge. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So probably a future president. Just guessing.
Right.
You know? Yeah. Smart as a whip. Speaks
I know.
5, just like his mother.
Oh, yes, his mom speaks like 5 or 6 languages.
Yeah,
I get very angry when people say she's ignorant.
it's astonishing how smart she is, you know. And so, you know, and he was, you see it, if you ever saw the video of him with Barron as a baby and Melania in Trump's office, it's, you know, you can tell right away that she is going to teach that kid to be smart as a whip. So anyway, so
And a good boy.
yeah, very good
Good
boy.
man.
Yeah. So anyway, you want to talk about the president? You know, so there's a little video that sort of runs down the story of these two. It has
Okay.
something. It has a little bit in it that's completely wrong and gives a completely wrong impression about their relationship, which I'll get to as soon as we see the video. But the video is pretty good. Otherwise, if you can put up with a narrator who's talking about himself a little much.
This sounds like a bad episode of Saved by the Bell.
Yeah.
Who the hell is he? If you've never heard of James Madison, that's because he is what's known as a forgotten president. Pretty much anyone can name 6 or 7 presidents, but there's about 20 that you have never heard of. In fact, he left such a small impression on the presidency that I feel like cheating just talking about him, and I'll talk about the following president as well. He was the first president to wear trousers. All the other presidents wore breeches.
What's
This
the
is the most
difference?
interesting fact about this guy.
Breeches
He
are
was
at the
known as the
knees.
father of the Constitution. He was also known as the father of the Bill of Rights. His second cousin was Zachary Taylor, who became the 12th president of America. He is also a forgotten president. He suffered frostbite of the nose. He was 5'4" and only weighed 100 pounds, making him the smallest American president ever. His friends called him Little Jimmy. The Star-Spangled Banner anthem was written during his presidency. I actually counted. It took me 39 attempts to say Star-Spangled Banner Anthem. I was like Star-Spangled Bangered Banter Anthem. Yeah, it's like a tongue twister. He famously said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary."
True that.
In my notes, I said, "If men were angles." Oh no, that's the version I published in my book. I gotta fix that. I wrote a book about American presidents, so if you buy a copy and it says angles, I'm sorry, the typo went out, so apologies. The White House burned down during his presidency. Oh, he can't do anything right. He is the only president to have 2 vice presidents that died while serving office.
Oh, wow.
His final words were, "I always talk better lying down." His cause of death is unknown. Like, how boring is this guide? How did he die? I don't know. How boring do you have to be to make you dying not interesting enough to remember? Alright, that's it. Let's move on to the next guy. Although this guy is also considered to be a forgotten president, he was extremely influential during his 8 years as president. When James Monroe was elected, he took 15 weeks off to visit cities throughout the country. These visits were considered a goodwill tour, and newspapers started declaring that Americans were living in the era of good feelings. This was the first time since the presidency began where America was no longer involved in wars. The American people assumed they wouldn't be in another war again. How very, very wrong they were. Monroe had a habit of just showing up randomly at historic moments and rubbing shoulders with many major figures. He's like a historical Forrest Gump. He served Lord Sterling. He took care of the Marquis de Lafayette after he was wounded in the Battle of Brandywine Creek. When George Washington was a general, the two crossed Delaware together through Valley Forge. Monroe and his friends broke into the mansion of the corrupt Governor Dunmore and stole 200 muskets, 300 swords, and 18 pistols. He gave all the weapons to the local militia to help with the revolution. He was only 17 at the time. He got shot by a musket ball in the shoulder, which severed an artery, nearly killing him. His friend tied it off, saving his life. It took him 2 months to recuperate. He famously said, "The best form of government is that which is most likely to prevent the greatest sum of evil." Monroe investigated the first political sex scandal since the beginning of the American presidency. He played a key role in investigating the sex scandal of the first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. Monroe had a reputation to never back down from a fight. Even when he was in his 60s, Senator and Minister William Crawford threatened Monroe in the White House after the president fired several of Crawford's friends. Crawford roared at Monroe and said, "I wish you would not dilly-dally." It was
Wow.
probably intimidating at the time.
That's an insult.
Even though Crawford was over a decade younger than Monroe, the
What does that
president wasn't
mean?
remotely intimidated. Instead, he got up from his chair, picked up burning tongs from his fireplace, and stared out
I
Crawford
will
until he
miss
left.
you.
He's only the second person who served as Secretary of War and Secretary of State simultaneously. This was during the War of 1812. In 1814, the British burned down the White House, the Capitol, the Library of Congress, and the Supreme Court. Monroe took the oath of office in 1816, where the White House was so heavily burnt that it didn't even have furniture. The original builder of the White House, James Hoban, had to rebuild it. Monroe used so much of his own money to refurbish the White House that he found himself in heavy debt for most of his life. When the White House was rebuilt, it was the first time that it was painted white. Okay, here's a few quick ones. 2 years after Monroe's presidency, America entered its first economic depression. It lasted 3 years. He was the first president to ride in a steamboat. He was the last founding father to become president. His nickname was the Last Cocked Hat. He ran unopposed during his re-election, and he was heavily criticized for wearing clothes that were decades out of date. Monroe called slavery an evil institution. Nevertheless, 40 slaves worked on his 600-acre tobacco farm. He gave his slaves more freedom than most, but he still believed that white people were superior, which kind of defeats the concept of slavery being bad. Bit of a double standard, Monroe. Monroe dreamed of forming an African state populated entirely by freed slaves. Liberia is an African country that is colonized by freed African Americans. The capital, Monrovia, is named after Monroe. I'll be talking about Liberia more in an upcoming countries video, so watch out for that if you want to know more about that country. Many slave owners chose slaves based on their abilities, but Monroe did everything in his power to keep his slaves' families together. Since Monroe's legacy revolved around slavery, it's not too hard to believe that he himself was nearly kidnapped by an army of white, African, and Haitian slaves in 1800. Hours before the kidnapping was meant to occur, some of the slaves chickened out and ran to inform Monroe of the plan. The slaves were caught, nearly 30 of them were hanged at the gallows.
Oh, dang!
After his presidency, Monroe had to sell his plantation in 1830 and moved in with his daughter as he was practically penniless. Monroe died of tuberculosis. He died on July the 4th, just like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams.
Oh my God!
His
They all
final
died on
words
July the
were,
4th?
"I regret that I should leave this world without again holding him." He was talking about his best friend, James Madison, the previous president. Hey guys, just to let you know that obviously when I'm done all of these persons, I'll move on to another subject. If you check out my Amazon account under my name, James Egan, you will see all the books I've written. I've written books about pretty much everything: space, animals, actors, movies, comic books, whatever. And see whatever one tickles your fancy, and if I get enough demand about it, I'll start doing facts about that one. So check it out, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Wow, that was packed full.
Yeah, you know, pretty good. You know, by James Ego, was that his name? You know, but
was it Ego or Egan? I like the Monty Python thing. Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
Good sense of humor, but a little bit of why we divorced ourselves from the British, I think. You know, so. now this, let me clear up this whole deal about holding him.
Right.
You know. You
like
listen
alluding to the fact that he might have been gay.
No. Okay. The Monroe and Madison initially clashed, worked together with all the other founding fathers and the founding people, and then they became friends through public service, and they became such fast friends. Here's what really went down on death. There's a guy named Tench Ringgold who was his attendant, Monroe's attendant, as he was dying.
Tench Ringo?
Tench, Tench, Ringgold, Ringgold. They had strange names in those days. They were like the first rappers or something.
Right? Tench, come here. I'm in a clinch.
Yeah, Tench, I'm in a pinch. You know, yeah. Oh my God. So anyway, it says so Tench wrote. He said during his illness, talking to Monroe, he often mentioned you. He's talking to Madison. He's writing to Madison, to me, and expressed not only his most affectionate regard, respect, and esteem for you, which it gave him, but his great regret that he should leave this world without having the happiness of once more beholding his oldest and most valued friend, of Mrs.
What
Madison.
Idiot. He wants to be holding you. Oh my God.
Yeah. So the guy got it wrong.
Give
So
him the benefit of the doubt here.
yeah. And he says of Mrs. Madison, which was Dolly Madison, the very famous Dolly Madison.
Oh, is that the Dolly Madison cupcakes?
That's Dolly Madison cupcakes. He likewise often spoke with affectionate respect and esteem. Right. So this was written in July of 1831. But Monroe had written to Madison directly himself in April of that year. And he says, I deeply regret that there is no prospect of our ever meeting again, since so long have we been connected, and in the most friendly intercourse, not sexual intercourse.
Right. Our friend would have picked that up and twisted it into
Yeah, God, in public and private life, that a final separation is among the most distressing incidents that could occur. So that's really, they were just very, very close friends,
Yes.
A-
So
after-
it appears that they were geographically at a distance.
yeah. But they were
Their
both
age.
they were both Virginians, the heavy Virginian contingent of the founding fathers, Patrick Henry and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. So anyway, so that's just to clear that up. So now Matt and so this guy with his video, this is why people really need to dig into history. This guy with his video says forgotten presidents. Well, we haven't forgotten what they established, which is massive on both of their parts. James Madison was the father of the Constitution. And he's basically, if anybody, is responsible for the Bill of Rights. So, okay, forgotten Constitution, Bill of Rights, right? There's this thing that goes around about founding fathers being deists, which is God set the universe in motion. Good luck, have a good time, do what you can. That's a basic deist thing. It's not true. Monroe was a little bit deist, maybe. But Madison, as I've said in earlier things, attended church services on Sunday in the Capitol, just like Thomas Jefferson did, both of them while serving as president. So not deist. He was, James Madison was tutored by a famous Presbyterian minister named John Witherspoon, who was the only minister who signed the Declaration of Independence. All right. And he, his intercourse with Witherspoon made him passionate about religious freedom. So for dissenters, particularly, the deal about church and state, well, they didn't want an Anglican church. They didn't want a state church, just like England had, which had the king as the head of the church, basically, which was ridiculous. So they wanted people to have freedom of religion and freedom to dissent, right? And Madison considered entering the ministry himself, becoming a Presbyterian minister. 1773, he writes a letter to a friend, and he says, the rising stars of his generation renounced their secular prospects. And here's what he said: publicly declare their unsatisfactoriness by becoming fervent advocates in the cause of Christ. Right. So he was like, be a fervent advocate in the cause of Christ. But 2 months later, he decides to not be a minister. He's going to study law. Right. And so he studied law with Thomas Jefferson,
Really?
Yeah.
That's a small circle.
Yeah, I know. So they had the Philadelphia Convention in I'm going to skip ahead from the Revolutionary War uh, in 1787, and whether they were going to ratify the Constitution. And those who wanted to do that were called the Federalists. And Madison at the time was a Federalist himself. Well, that changed. When he was elected president in 1808, the emphasis was kind of like Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase. He was continuing the idea of acquiring more land, expanding America, much like a president we have today.
Yes. We're trying to get Greenland and Canada and
Yeah, and so
we renamed the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America.
Yeah, so just like in music, there are harmonics. Life is a series of waves, and there are harmonics today from things that happened then, back during the Revolutionary War. And it happens over periods of time in the United States, and that's one of the points of my doing this whole series, right? So, so they put together the Constitution, before he's president, and Madison was kind of the main guy. That's why he's called the founder of the Constitution. He was kind of running the show, really. He studied more than 200 amendments. So they're trying, you have these 2,000-page things today that they try to run through and jam all this stuff in and don't give people a chance to read it.
Yeah, no one's going to read it, so they can, get the legislation passed, and they bring it in on a little, cart with a horse and buggy.
Yeah, well, they didn't do that back then because somebody would have shot somebody.
Right. I don't think so. Most of the people couldn't even read.
That's true. That's true.
Looks like we're going back to that method.
Yeah. So
we can read, but we're just not gonna.
Yeah. So you had these different states proposing amendments and wanting to get them ratified, and these things in their different conventions and stuff. So Madison reads these over 200 amendments, and finally distills this all down to the Bill of Rights, which passes on June 8, 1789. And he wanted to restrict the federal government and protect things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, right to peaceful assembly. And he drew from these ratifying conventions from the states, but it was him who kind of navigated through all this stuff and particularly gave us freedom of the press and property protection, and prevented people from unnecessary, outlandish government seizures, like they do in some places, and also jury trials. He was big on jury trials. Okay. Now, during the war, he was a major advisor to George Washington.
Huh.
Yeah. And he,
is that because he was a lawyer?
No, yeah, kind of, I guess. But he was just a smart guy. He was just a very smart guy, and he helped George Washington write his first inaugural address, which took place in New York City. They didn't have Washington, D.C. back then, and he was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, fellow Virginian, and was advised Washington on cabinet appointments. And because of him, Thomas Jefferson became the first Secretary of State.
Wow.
And then here's another one, which reflects on today. When the first Congress was convened, James Madison introduced a bill on, guess what? Tariffs. Tariffs. Right. And they established a federal tariff on imports and it was called the Tariff of 1789, right? And then later, they had a tariff of 1816. You know, he became president in 1808. And so they had the tariff of 1816. And that was the first tariff that was passed by Congress. And it was all about protecting manufactured items in the U.S. from overseas competition, because commerce was a big deal going back and forth, you know, and where the money, who was making the money and how. And it was from the beginning. The Stamp Act, England wanted more money. We don't like that. We're going to have a war. Okay, now we won the war.
So 1816, he creates the protective tariff. And in 2016, Trump gets elected as president.
Yeah. See what I mean? Yeah. So
And now, and do you think he would have been able to do more in his first term if they didn't attack him so much as they did?
I actually think it worked out perfectly, as odd as that sounds, because if Trump had been able to run through some of the things that he wanted to do,
He might not have run again, or
well, he would have run again, but they would have found a way to subvert him, and their chicanery and their manipulations behind the scenes would never have been exposed like they were, and you never would have had the crazy Biden presidency, which exposed them even further, you know. So whenever Donald Trump is talking about tariffs and stuff, you know, the tariffs worked, and he says, well, they worked, and we were at the beginning of the 19th century, we were doing better than ever and stuff.
right.
You know, well, this goes back all the way back to them, to the tariffs and stuff, right?
Mhm.
And here's another thing that James Madison did that was very good idea. He didn't want a standing federal army, just like George Washington didn't want one, because he is, as many of the founding fathers knew, if you put something in place, it's harder to get it out of place once it's put in place. And a standing federal army, if you had a corrupt person in office, could be abused against the citizens. All right. So Madison was, he didn't want that happening, you know. So but one of the other precedents that he, forgotten president, well, it's forgotten because nobody's paying enough attention to history.
Right.
One of the other precedents that he did was he married a Dolly Payne Todd. Now, once again, just like Todd, yeah, that Todd was
Mary Todd Lincoln.
No. Todd was a married name. She was married to a guy named John Todd, who was a Quaker farmer, and he died of yellow fever. And so James Madison, just like George Washington, just like Thomas Jefferson, married a widow, because people died back in those days and stuff, you know.
Mhm.
And they didn't have any kids either. So, but she kind of set the precedent for what a first lady is like. You know, she was known for her graciousness and the social occasions at the White House and stuff like that. You know, so he was. Oh God, that dog's barking. But he was in Jefferson's cabinet when Jefferson, so it was George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson lost to John Adams. John Adams served, and Thomas Jefferson won. And so Thomas Jefferson made James Madison Secretary of State. Now, James Madison didn't have a bunch of experience as an ambassador like some of these other people did, John Quincy Adams and some of these other people. But Dolly was a big influence on him on how that kind of stuff worked, and foreign things and all that. how she knew this by being married to a Quaker farmer, I don't know, but she was really kind of influential, you know, grace and stature and that sort of thing, kind of the way Melania is with Donald Trump. You know, it's really interesting, right? So then, you know, James Madison is president, and the British are giving us trouble. We're trying to do trade with France, and the British would intercept our ships and impress some of the sailors on the American ships. And the impress doesn't mean like skip press or impress. It means to take them into custody like a press gang and make them sailors. And some of these sailors had been British subjects in the colonies. And so the British just grabbed them. So this kind of stuff was going on. So finally, a lot of machinations went back and forth, and we ended up with the War of 1812 in Madison's first term. So we got the video of the War of 1812, which if you want to play that one.
Okay.
The causes of the War of 1812. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bell Ringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and check out the questions down in the description. So in order to understand the causes of the War of 1812, we first have to look over to Europe and see what was going on there at the time. In 1803, France and Britain officially went to war with one another as part of what is known as the Napoleonic Wars. Remember, in the wake of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power in France and was basically conquering all of Europe. In fact, Napoleon even had his eyes on conquering North America as well, but that's a whole nother story that would actually lead to the Louisiana Purchase, and in order to learn more about that, you can check out one of my other videos. But nonetheless, Britain and France were at war, which put America in kind of an awkward situation because we had trade connections with each country. The United States officially declared that we had neutral rights, or basically the right to sail the sea without taking a side, but very quickly, American trade ships began to get seized by the French and British naval forces. But the British seizing of ships especially angered Americans as the British began to practice what was known as impressment. Impressment was forcing sailors to serve in the British Navy,
Oh,
or
Lord.
really basically kidnapping sailors and putting them into the British Navy. Estimates are between 1793 to 1812, 15,000 American sailors were impressed or kidnapped by the
Oh
British
my
Navy.
God.
Of course, the British argued, claiming that many of these sailors had deserted British ships and had gone over to work on American ships for better wages, so they were obligated to serve for the British since they were technically British. So impressment was the primary issue Americans were upset about that would
Everybody
lead to
was
the War of
British.
1812. But there were other issues as well. Many Americans believed that the British were arming and encouraging Native American attacks on American settlements on the western frontier. And of course, the western frontier of America at this time was really the Mississippi River Valley. And of course, after Lewis and Clark's expedition to explore the land acquired in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, lots of Americans were eyeing land out to the west. Furthermore, we had this incident of the attack on the Chesapeake. Now, the Chesapeake was an American trade ship that in June of 1807 set out from Norfolk, Virginia, heading for the Mediterranean Sea. As the Chesapeake got out to open water, it was stopped by a British warship, the HMS Leopard. The British captain of the Leopard demanded to search the Chesapeake. Well, of course, the crew of the Chesapeake, they didn't want to let them on board because they were fearful of being impressed or kidnapped, as I had talked about earlier. When the captain of the Chesapeake refused to allow the Leopard to board, the Leopard opened fire and killed 3 crew members of the Chesapeake. Americans were absolutely outraged by the attack, and the rally cry throughout the country became, "Remember the Chesapeake." Remember what the British had done to this innocent merchant ship. Some Americans began to argue that America needed to go to war with Britain. In Congress, there were new young congressmen that began to organize together into a group known as the War Hawks that were pushing for war. They were led by young congressmen such as Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, which of course, they'll be huge figures in American politics for the next 40 years. With the mounting calls for war, by June 1st of 1812, President James Madison sent a letter to Congress asking them to declare war. Remember, presidents cannot declare war. It is Congress that has that power according to the
Right.
Constitution. And so James Madison, in fact, is the first president in American history to request that Congress declare war. In his letter, his primary argument was, again, impressment and Native American attacks on the western frontier, which he blamed on the British. On June 18, 1812, Congress voted and officially declared war on Britain. But consider this, when the U.S. declared war, there were 6,700 soldiers in the American military. Compare that to over 240,000 in the British military. Plus, the British had the most powerful navy in the world compared to the U.S., who had basically almost no navy. So when we declare war, the United States is extremely unprepared to go to war. Lastly, a few confusing aspects of the War of 1812. It's called the War of 1812 because we declared war in 1812, but honestly, the true fighting doesn't occur until 1814. The British were far too occupied with fighting Napoleon in Europe to pay any attention to this U.S. declaration of war. The British basically say, we'll get to you later when the United States declares war on them.
Oh,
Next,
wow.
America's primary argument was impressment, but by the time we declare war on Britain, the British Parliament had already repealed or canceled the policy of impressment. But due to slow communication of the time, the United States did not know that. If we would have had a phone or maybe internet access back then,
Right.
The whole war
The
might
war
have been
is
avoided
canceled.
altogether. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.
Wow. Yeah. People don't realize how slow communication was, which I think that's why the two presidents said, we're remiss that we're not going to see one another, because it could have taken them, months to travel
Right.
to where they were.
Right.
Yeah,
And
it was.
yeah.
Yeah, it was slow up until the 50s because the overseas, they showed the newsreels after when you went to the movies. They would show the newsreels from overseas before they showed the movies.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that was Well,
Yeah,
now
yeah.
I'm giving my age away.
Yeah, well, I remember it too. I'm same deal there. And until the 1950s, and the interstate highway system, which was President Eisenhower's, was shepherded that, and that was basically to allow military to travel quickly across the country. So there were things like that. When Napoleon lost at Waterloo to Wellington, there was a spy watching the battle for Rothschild in England, and so Rothschild's spy gets word to him, and Rothschild acts like Napoleon has won, and so the stock market in England freaks out, selling, and Rothschild goes in and buys it all up. And it becomes the richest guy, right? So this kind of stuff took place. Now, Madison had two people. He had Albert Gallatin, who I think Gallatin, Tennessee is named after, and John Quincy Adams over in Europe, in England, negotiating this whole war thing, and they pulled it off, and they had the Treaty of Ghent, G-H-E-N-T, Ghent, Belgium, I guess is where it took place. And that was settled. It was signed on December 24th, 1814. Now, the famous last battle of the war in 1812 took place. It was ratified, but it was ratified on February 14th, 1815, right? So the battle that took place in January 1815, the Battle of New Orleans, and Andy Jackson pulling off this miracle of defeating the British forces, the war was over, but they didn't know it. So that's the kind of thing that went on back then. So anyway, so with all this stuff, James Madison got his picture on American currency, which you probably don't know. Wow. He was on the $5,000 bill.
$5,000 bill. That could explain why we don't know about it.
Yeah, he was Exactly. So, yeah, I need a $5,000 bill. I gotta go
Can
pay
you
my
break this
mortgage.
$5,000 bill? No, I'm
Yeah,
sorry. Well, can I have food anyway? Okay.
yeah. So it was there's a little tidbit I came up with. A $5,000 Federal Reserve Madison note sold at Heritage Auctions in 2023 for $300,000. So if you know anybody that's got a $5,000 bill, James Madison on a picture, tell
It's now
them,
worth 300,000. That's
or
the cost of
more.
inflation.
That was 2023, so we're 2 years down the road.
Right.
So yeah, okay. So now we come to the fifth forgotten president, according to that guy, of the United States, which is James Monroe, and who's 6 feet tall. Unlike little Jimmy. little Jimmy was pretty tough if you can everything is considered. So James Monroe was the president from 2 terms, 1817 1825, and he's the last founding father person considered to be a founding father to serve as president, and he was the last Virginian president. Out of all these Virginians. And he was with Thomas Jefferson in the Democrat Republican Party, whose opponents were the Federalists. Madison had been Federalist, and then he ended up in the Democrat Republican Party. And I said Madison earlier studied law under Thomas Jefferson. It was Monroe. But Madison did become a lawyer. But so Monroe studied law under Thomas Jefferson more than once. So, you wonder why Thomas Jefferson established the University of Virginia. Well, he was quite the lawyer, and that's why he was chosen to basically author the Declaration of Independence, right? So, but when Monroe, who had, as that initial video said, had been involved with George Washington crossing the Delaware, he was very tight with George Washington. He spent Valley Forge with George Washington. He was a captain at the time in the Army. Monroe was a fighter, and in 17 he got elected to the Senate, and then in 1794 George Washington picked him to be ambassador to France, right? And but then I don't think he did so well because George Washington pulled him back in 1796. So, yeah. And then a few years later, he's elected governor of Virginia, and he was a big proponent of Thomas Jefferson's presidential candidacy in 1800, and so these two were tight, and he helped Thomas Jefferson negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, and then he fell out with Madison. Monroe was friends with Madison, but he fell out with him because there was a treaty called the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty, and Monroe negotiated that with Britain, and they had a falling out about that. And then he challenged Madison. Madison wanted to get the Democrat-Republican nomination in presidential election, but Madison won, the thing. So anyway, during the War of 1812 and the last parts of it, they're falling out, not falling out anymore, because Monroe becomes Madison's Secretary of State and his Secretary of War. He did both of them at the same time, just like that initial video said. And this combination of these two working together defeats the Federalists. Now, the Federalists keep going down. Who are the Federalists? This is like Alexander Hamilton and the people who wanted a centralized American government and this ruling power from the top kind of thing, And there was even rumors that went around back then because Hamilton was from Jamaica, and
Really?
yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah, and he was tight with Washington, but there was rumors that Hamilton was kind of maybe working for the British Crown or something. So there were these fights going back and forth. Hamilton and Jefferson had dueling newspapers in D.C., one for Hamilton, one for Jefferson. So there's this fight going on back and forth all the time between the Democrat-Republican Party, Madison, Monroe, Jefferson, and Hamilton and his cronies, who are the Federalists, right? So anyway, Monroe gets elected president, and the Federalist Party just collapses, right? And then Monroe, to so much of a degree that when Monroe runs for a second term, he's unopposed. There's nobody,
Wow.
Which,
Wow.
with the way things are going right now, if Donald Trump does as well as I think he's going to do, Donald Trump might run unopposed. So
he punked everybody. I think in 2016, he punked them and said that he sent out this thing that said that he would be president to infinity, and it was like this clock that just kept going. Maybe that just freaked all the Dems out.
Yeah,
well, now they're talking about a third term, so they really freaking the Dems out.
Well, the third term is based on some thing that could very possibly happen. So Trump could finish this term.
Mm-hmm.
He could. J.D. Vance could run as president, pick Donald Trump as vice president, get in office, get sworn in, and resign. And then
I heard that. And I guess that's legal.
Yeah, well, it's been talked about, never been done. But somebody asked Steve Bannon about that recently, and Bannon says, "Yeah, we're looking into it." And people thought, "Well, he's just."
I know,
but
we're
he's
looking
not
into it for sure.
No, it's really it's really a possibility, So okay, so Monroe continues. John Quincy Adams wanted to be conciliatory to Britain, and there was trouble with the Spanish, and but the Spanish were having trouble. The Spanish controlled the port of New Orleans and an entrance to the Mississippi River, and that's on our western border at the time. And so Spain is, they came over here and they stole all the gold from all these people, and they're controlling Florida, but they're losing their grip. And so Monroe and his people get into this thing. We end up getting Florida under James Monroe, so and a lot of conciliation with Spain. Spain just kind of gave up, So he also negotiated in 1784, before he's even president, he negotiated American rights to freely navigate the Mississippi River, right? And Jefferson was his mentor during this time. So this is a close group of friends that are collaborating among each other, supporting each other, and appointing each other ambassadors and all this sort of stuff. All of these people into making America great. It's making America great again. Well, these are the guys that made America great.
Yeah.
And so Jefferson is mentoring Monroe. They live not far from each other, actually. But then then Jefferson's great antagonist, Alexander Hamilton.
I have a question. Why did all the liberals like Hamilton?
Because I'm getting to that right now.
Okay.
Monroe was in Congress, and he's taking part in 1792. The first sex scandal in American politics. There's a guy named James Reynolds, and James Reynolds got a wife. Right. This is November 1792, and and the word gets out that Alexander Hamilton is paying hush money to James Reynolds. Now, he gives him $1,300, which was massive. It's like $400,000 now or something, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And why did he give him that? Because Hamilton is screwing Reynolds' wife. You know? So why do the lefties like Hamilton? Well, they're and Hamilton.
My thoughts are not going to come out of my head right now.
Right.
And so Hamilton and the Federalists, they were like central bank, central power, federal power, you know, all that sort of stuff. And Jefferson and you know, the agrarian society he espoused, and his people, and the Virginians, they're totally opposed to this, you know. So,
Lord.
Yeah. So, and so, before he's president, he becomes governor of Virginia. So he's even more until 1802, and so he's even more prepared to be president, you know. And so the War of 1812 happens, and Monroe, I forget who it was that told him, but there's somebody, was it Patrick Henry? It might have been Patrick Henry. I think it's Patrick Henry who gets word to Monroe that the British are going to take Washington, and he's got to get the hell out of there. So he and Dolly he and Dolly. So Monroe and his wife get out of, not Dolly Madison. Monroe and his wife, he wasn't having an affair with Dolly Madison. Oh God, you know, it's been so long ago, it's hard to remember these things. So they get out of DC just in time, and just like that video, that first video, you know, or the second video, they burned down Congress, they burned down the White House. You know, the British, it looked like the British were going to just totally.
Was it the British that burned it down?
Yes, the British came into DC and just burned everything up.
Wow, those Fookers.
Yeah. So, but then here we get to one of my ideas that the hand of God was involved at various points in American history. And when it looked like we were really going down, something bad was going to happen. Something miraculous happened. And that was the British attack on Fort McHenry. And I've got you've got a video of that about Francis Scott Key and everything, and what happened, and what moved Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. And it looked like it was all over, and let's watch what happened.
Okay.
British ships of war approach the port of Baltimore.
We just bring it back to the very beginning.
On September 12, 1814, British ships of war approach the port of Baltimore.
In the entire Royal Navy, there were 8 bomb ships. 5 of them were sitting there in the Patapsco River. These are the most powerful siege artillery afloat.
On board one of these British warships, an American, Francis Scott Key.
Talk about a witness to history. He finds himself in Baltimore Harbor just prior to this battle.
The concrete rocket's red glare lights up the skies over the harbor.
It was like a fireworks display. People who watched it were enthralled. They were terrified of the noise, absolutely terrified. But they saw a kind of beauty in it.
The heavy fire goes on and on. Aboard an enemy attack ship, Francis Scott Key hears the British plans for Baltimore and fears the worst.
He knows that the level of hatred that's directed at the city would probably mean death and destruction of the town.
The barrage from the water is constant, and with British infantry marching on the city's borders, Key knows Baltimore's fate looks grim.
Key paced the deck of his ship in the darkness, hoping the explosions would continue, because if they didn't, he knew that the fort had capitulated.
The siege lasts all night. As dawn nears, there is a sudden silence.
Key was on board the ship wondering and asking himself what flag would be raised over the fort.
The morning mist began to clear, and he made out the stars and stripes flying above the fort.
The American experiment, the American nation, for that moment, was surviving.
Mary Pickersgill's masterpiece unfurls over the fort.
Never before had he looked with such reverence upon the symbol of his country. Never before had the flag had such a sheen to its glory.
It was the glory of victory. The wool catches the wind. The stars and stripes wave in the face of the enemy. The British are convinced the fort cannot be breached. Baltimore has been saved.
Pretty good, huh? You know?
Yes.
So you got a war in 12, which basically lasted only about a year. The British do that attack in September. Now, if word got back about Fort McHenry to England and then the Treaty of Ghent signed in December, well, maybe the British sent word back and says, hey, we can't take the fort. We gave it everything we got, all our biggest guns, our 50 ships, whatever the ships they've got. And so that might have been why they gave up. I don't know. I wasn't there, you know. But so Mr. Forgotten President.
I know, but the narrator of that thing looked like he was there.
Yeah, I know. It sounds like that. Yeah. So, but Mr. Forgotten President James Monroe, under his presidency, we got the Star Spangled Banner. So we haven't forgotten that, because every sporting event that they go to, then somebody sings it, seeing if they can beat the best one that did it before them, you know. Right. So unless you're Roseanne Barr, and then you ruin it. You ever saw that? I think she still regrets that now that she's
poor Roseanne,
Miss Patriot, you know. So anyway,
we love her anyway.
Yeah. So, you know, so they settled the war. Now we're not at war with anybody for the first time since 1775, you know, in 1815. So you got, you know, 40 years of some kind of war is going on. So now no war. So we got the era of good feelings, they called it. It was like, it might as well have been called the era of relief. We're no longer at war. But
Kind of like
down
when Trump got in office.
Yeah, exactly. but down in Florida, there was something going on that I didn't previously mention. Spain was having problems, but they were affiliated with the Seminoles, the Seminole Indians, Native
Yeah.
Americans. And what were the Seminoles doing? Well, they were going into the American colonies and raiding them, and so we couldn't put up with that. So we ended up making, and Spain couldn't control them. And so America makes this deal with Spain, and they've got all these American claims against Spain, who's over the Seminoles, that amounted to $5 million in legal claims, suing Spain or however they did it back in those days. So we make a deal with Spain and we say, and Spain says, okay, you can have Florida, you can deal with the Seminoles, but you got to drop these $5 million in claims. So we went, okay, we got Florida. Now the little
What was that
caveat,
called? That wasn't like the Louisiana Purchase or anything. Did they even name that?
it was the Adams Onus, ONIS, Adams-Onus. So John Quincy Adams and Onus, whoever Onus was, treaty, and that ceded Florida to us,
Nice.
and it also defined the boundary between Spanish and American possessions in North America. So we kind of settled it with the British. So we settled it with the Britain, we settled it with the Spain, and we got this era of good feelings. So then a few years later, 1823, James Monroe is addressing Congress, the annual address to Congress thing. And his address on December 2nd, 1823, becomes what's became called the Monroe Doctrine,
Yes.
which was basically, okay, you Europeans, stay out of here. This is our territory. We don't want you bozos coming over here and trying to take over things that we've now established for ourselves, right? And that's how, and the Monroe Doctrine has held until today, and Donald Trump is certainly emphasizing the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine with America first, right?
Yes.
So the president of James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine, the Congress back then, era of good feelings, here it is echoing today. It's resonating, same sort of thing, right? And now the other interesting thing with him, which was covered in that first video, was that he also was, a Virginian, slaves, all that sort of stuff. He also was trying to figure out what to do with slavery, and that's and he was enough of an opponent to it, despite being caught in the middle of it, just like Thomas Jefferson, that a bunch of freed slaves, went back to Africa, established the country of Liberia, and named the capital after James Monroe, Monrovia, So, wow. And a lot of people don't know that, including people in Monrovia, California.
Right.
They don't know where Monrovia.
I was thinking about that. Is Monrovia, California named after James Monroe?
Yeah, well, it's yeah. I mean, but it has to do with Liberia. It's you want me to do a show on Monrovia?
Well, I mean, I wonder, because when I was looking at the lineage with my father, who was on paper my father, there's Monroes in my family. And I also went to look at Marilyn Monroe, and my grandmother was a baker.
No.
So
wow.
I think I might, in some distant relation, be related to Marilyn Monroe through the Monroe name and the Baker name, because Monroe, I believe, was it a married name, or was it her Norma Jean's mother's maiden name, and then she married a baker?
Yeah, it was something like that. It was something the latter there,
Right. So that's the name that she took. But I even wrote to one of her sisters. I don't know if because she had other sisters too I think from the Baker family. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Huh. Well, anyway, so the last little thing with Monroe was, we're continually expanding west, and so then when you get to the state of Missouri, and Missouri was going to come into the Union, and there was a big fight over. The Southerners were like, "Hey, Missouri gets to be a slave state. It's down in the South, kind of, and Monroe is right in the middle of that, and you end up with the Missouri Compromise,
Right.
which was sort of the beginning of the dissolution of slavery. Really, it was like every new state that comes in, it's not going to be allowed to have slaves like the others were. There was no prescription against slavery in the northern states. It just didn't need them. They weren't agrarian, but the other states could have been. So anyway, and he was very much into expansion. He was the first American president to visit the western borders of the U.S., and he was involved there were relentless attacks on Native American settlements. We were basically the bad white people were going in, and Native Americans, get out of here. We're taking over. And Monroe was trying to settle all that and stop that kind of stuff from happening. And so he then so his ended in he was 73 when he died in 1831, and he's like Thomas Jefferson and like John Adams died on July 4th, just like the thing said. And he was also the last U.S. president to wear a powdered wig.
Why was he the last one?
Well, the others just didn't do it. It was a tradition. It's like those British justices that go into court and they've got this powdered wig on and stuff. Yeah. For some reason they did. I don't know why they did powdered wigs. They had lice. Their hair fell out. I don't know what.
Yeah, their hair fell out. They were all bald and ugly looking mutts, and so they just put on their grandma's long dress.
Powdered wig.
They were trannies. From the beginning.
Didn't you also say he was the one that they made fun of because he was dressed out of date? His clothes were out of date.
Well, he wore trousers. They wore breeches. Have you ever seen those golf outfits? Where they end at the knee and stuff. That's what these guys wore. They wore hose and into their breeches.
They were cross dressers, Skip.
Yeah, hey, now we get the real nitty gritty.
Right, the grandma's wig. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah.
Yes. So anyway, and so that's why they called him the last cocked hat, because he didn't do that. He didn't, the cocked hat, the tri-corner hat, that sort of deal.
Right.
Yeah. So. And then he there was a whole deal about he died, and he was he missed Madison. He couldn't see Madison before he died and everything. So that's basically James Monroe and James Madison. So you can see all these things that these characters, this interweaving and even oppositions they had of each other, and this is how America was built, and these things continue till today. And a lot of the troubles that we have today is because we've got all these laws and regulations and all these things that have built up over time, and we've got too much, and it's almost too much for people to deal with. And so, you get a 2,000-page bill in Congress, these Democrats put through. Oh, you got 24 hours to read it. and it's
Mhm.
filled full of stuff that these lobbyists jammed into them, and get some kickback money going on, get hired as a lobbyist after you leave Congress, that kind of garbage. Well, most Americans, they don't see that kind of paper unless they go into CVS and buy something, and you get this.
Yeah.
Or you buy a car, and a new car, and you've got like 30 pages of, oh yeah, sign here, oh yeah, sign here, oh yeah, sign here. So people just are like, hey, I don't know, I'm
Or
not
new terms and conditions, agree here, but you go look at it, and then 3 hours later you're through halfway through.
That's right.
Right,
That's right.
which is why the people in Congress don't want to read a bill that's 5 billion pages long.
Right. Right.
Kill the forest just to put it out.
Yeah, but if you know the basic principles of our civics and our government, and how they were formed and what they went through putting these things together, things make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
And so when I was watching a video on X, I think somewhere, somebody put together, and it's different people talking about tariffs. Chuck Schumer talking about tariffs are a good idea. Nancy Pelosi talking about tariffs are a good idea.
God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody cares what Nancy says. Nancy Pants.
Yeah, somebody else talking about, but these are in the past when it was a good idea and stuff.
Yeah,
and
Schumer said it was a good idea. But now in 1996, I believe.
Yeah.
It's not a good idea unless it's my idea.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yes, that's true.
And then the last video of this compilation I saw was a guy talking to Oprah in the 80s about tariffs and how the Japanese are ripping us off. And that was Donald Trump. So Donald Trump knew the history. When he starts talking about, he wasn't making this up. He studied it,
Yes.
So if you realize,
he watches this segment, he'll love it.
Yeah. I'm gonna tell him, get the word to him. I know this kid who's Barron's best friend. So
nice.
Bo Loud. Yeah. So anyway, but so you've got the tariff thing. This was when we finally got control as a nation of our own economy and our own destiny. We sort of made people pay to come sell their stuff over here. We turned the tables on the Britons. They were taxing us, with the Stamp Act and all that sort of stuff, Tea Party on, and so we turned the tables on everybody. It's like, you want to do business with us, it's going to cost money, so
that's the reciprocal taxes, because Canada just turned around and said, hey, we'll drop ours if you drop yours.
Yeah, now the big fight is China. China says, oh, you do 34% on us, we do 34% on you. Well, that's not going to last very long, because, all their crap that they sell on Amazon it's going to go way up.
I remember growing up, everything was made in China.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
We need to have that. Everything's made in the USA.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I was in high school, up until that time, everything made in Japan was a joke, after World War II. But then Panasonic came out with a transistor radio. And man, that was the best thing I'd ever owned at the time. I would go to sleep at night, my little Panasonic transistor radio turned on, listening to I'm in North Texas, and I'm listening to WLS out of Chicago with that transistor radio. I thought, man, things have sure turned around in Japan. So anyway, so that's, so this is the forgotten presidents who really should never be forgotten, because they pulled off some pretty great stuff.
Yes, because they were the ones, our ancestors, that made America great. And I want to thank you. I want to thank you again, Skip, for another wonderful presentation. Succinct, charming, funny. I'm still in my head seeing the one guy with Monty Python in there. I'm like, what? If you don't know what I'm talking about, you have to go back and watch this. My name is
Black
Penny
Knight,
Shepard.
one of the best
Yeah,
bits.
the Black
Yeah.
Knight.
Yeah.
And my name is Penny Shepard. This is Skip Press. Skip Press. How can people find you?
On X and on skippress.com, and go to Amazon and buy this book.
Destiny Redo.
Yeah, Destiny
Yeah.
Redo. Yeah. So,
And
yeah, I'm
what's the
getting-
premise of Destiny Redo?
Well, it's basically watch your words, watch your thoughts. Thoughts become words, words become actions, actions become habits, habit forms your character, and your character determines your destiny. But I realized you could work backwards from that, figure out something that you formed as a thought and carried it forward, or a habit you got into and stuff. And you realize when you started and why you started, it might not have been applicable, and you're having a problem with it. And it kind of blows everything apart, and you start having a problem. You stop having a problem with it. Like, for example, one thing that happened to me recently, I realized that when I got divorced, which was not my idea, I tried very hard to save the marriage, that my estimation of me and my worth as a person went way down. And subconsciously, I had been carrying that around for quite a while, right? And so that was recently, it was like 2 weeks ago. I end up with a new screenplay deal, 2 more book clients, and more money in the bank than I've had in a few months. And it's just because my own estimation of myself came up, and I kind of became more me, and it's just from using this little formula, this little very inexpensive book. So,
Well, I'm going to look for it. Where can we get
I'll
it?
send you one, Joan. I'll send you one.
Oh,
Yes,
okay,
it's on
great.
Amazon. Go to Amazon.com, or you can go to skippress.com
Yeah.
and peruse his site, and he's got like 50 different books.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. But so, this it's kind of the thing with this, when this history of America and these things, if you see when things were put in place that were proper, then we boomed. When things were put in place that were weird, we had trouble. So then somebody comes along and puts the proper stuff in place, and we start booming. And that's what Trump's doing now.
Yes.
And that goes back to that premise. If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Right.
So I think it's important. I said this on your first show because I love these.
Oh, thanks.
It reminds me of my history, but then there's things in there that I don't even know. So I'm learning something while I'm watching it. And so if you've got kids that, honestly, in our schools right now, they're probably not getting this. So let's bring them, show them these videos, go through the series. It's really worth it.
I agree.
Yeah.
Joan, where can people find you?
Oh my goodness. Well, here.
Like
Agent
forever.
X11. Yes. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Friday mornings, Friday evening shows that are taped, and then
It's all day Friday
later. And back up for everything else. And then Trauma Triage on the David Zublik channel on Mondays. And you can also find me on on X, Joan Renee 27.
I get it, because it's the X thing, Joan. It's the X thing.
Oh, I know. So, at any rate,
so you can find her at Joan Renee 27 on X. I am on X under Shepherd Out, which is an auspicious thing to say. We are out of time, but before we go, please watch The Awake Nation. We're on the David Zublik channel Monday through Friday. We're live. And that's 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. I realize it's really early. That's Eastern time. It may be really early, but if you can't watch us live, then please just go to the David Zubik channel on Rumble and take a look at some of the shows. You might get up in the middle of the night, say 3 o'clock in the morning in the Pacific time zone, have nothing better to do than to turn on the Rumble channel and watch us live. Because, it definitely won't put you back to sleep. So just FYI, it's not a sleeping pill. It's a wake-up pill. It's a wake-up call. So please join us. And you'll see us this following Monday. And then also, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, the Agent X11 channel, and then share it with your friends and bring your friends on in. None of us are getting paid to do this. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do, and we need to share this information. The way that we share it is to have your friends listen in, have your children listen in to most of the Agent X11s. Let me think about that for a second.
Not all of them, no.
Not all of them, okay? I'll have to put a rating on some of them. But anyway, thank you so very much for joining us. We appreciate all of you. I send you much love. And for now, we're out of time. So we're out of here. Shepherd out.
Renee out.
Skip out.
Goodbye for today from Agent X11, Hollywood Dark Journalist. We post new episodes daily. Join us for our true crime episodes on Fridays. Please watch our main show, David Zubik's Awake Nation, on the David Zubik channel on Rumble. We are live Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern.